My name is Seth Dellinger, and on behalf of the Feldenkrais Guild of North America's communication team, I am delighted to be talking with Taro Iwamoto today. So Taro, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So Taro is a Feldenkrais practitioner in Washington State. Been involved with the method for about a decade, but he has a very diverse movement background. Has also been involved in athletic training, physical therapy, martial arts, including Tai Chi and Aikido, and works with clients in particular who have pain, mobility, and balance issues. But Taro, just given that wide, diverse background, I'm just curious to begin by asking you sort of like the whole movement story. Movement is clearly at the center of your life. So where did that begin?
Where did that begin? My dad was probably the biggest influencer for me, and I grew up in watching him and doing some martial arts training as a kid. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to mimic what he was doing. And then soon I started practicing karate in Japan. And I was probably at the age of 5 or so. That's probably the beginning, but I was doing all kinds of stuff, weight training, punch bag and running with the weighted shoes and things like that. And I was like, wow, that's kind of cool. So that's how I began. And I've been always been involved with athletics and sports. I love sports, watching athletes and watching people with the great movement skills. And then I started playing various sports and martial arts included, and then rugby in high school. Then I actually continued to play rugby through college and club sports after college. And so that's probably my biggest sports. And naturally, and then I became interested in helping people who, play sports. And then I entered athletic training field and wanted to help people get back on the field as athletic trainer. And that's how I began my professional career. And then I transitioned into physical therapy settings and helping more general population with various conditions. And soon, and somehow I came across the Feldenkrais Method, and then I started studying the Feldenkrais Method and blend it into my movement teaching. So that's, and here I am.
Here you are. And people might know your face because you actually have a pretty popular channel on YouTube where you're sharing a lot of movement stuff, not only Feldenkrais, but right. Mostly with the Feldenkrais method. And the topic we had for discussion today was about sitting. And I just want to invite you, or you have some specific questions, but just hearing what you just said, I'm also curious about your perspective as we talk about sitting, of like, what is it from the Feldenkrais method that you've learned? And I imagine you draw on, all your background, like a lot of martial arts and rugby, get on the ground. And when I reached out to you, you said in particular, you would be interested in talking about sitting on the floor. So I just wanted to add that little thing about, would love to hear the Feldenkrais perspective, but any comparison you have. But first of all, just more generally, what is it that you love about sitting on the floor?
I did not really think much about it until I moved to the States. And for those of you who don't really know my background, I was born and raised in Japan, where we spend a fair amount of time on the floor, sitting on the floor. So that's our culture, right? In many ceremonies and traditional events, when people sit on the floor, and even people in the 60s and 70s, they still sit on the floor. Mm-hmm. So it's something that I never really thought much about it. And until I moved to the States, and that's not quite typical and for adults. And so that I became interested in, and why Is it, well, actually, as I started working with the people in an older population, and the people were shocked to see me so easily and comfortably sitting on the floor. Like, I wasn't really understanding why. What's the big deal? We sit all the time, and yet it is not something that is common culturally in the United States and many other countries, and in Europe and places like that. So I became very, very interested in what's the effect when the people transition to a sitting in a couch or chair, and it started to move away from the floor. And by the time they get to in 40s and 50s, and even just the thought of getting down onto the floor, it's just something, it just, like, they had to think about it. Like, do I really want to go down there?
Right.
Like, well, at that moment, it's something has already shifted quite a bit. And by the time they get to 60s and 70s, and for some people, for a lot of people, getting down onto the floor is not an even option unless somebody can help them get them back up on their feet. Like, wait a minute, and that's not right. And it is closely tied to a fear of falling too, because they don't want to fall, and they're really fearful of getting down onto the floor because they don't think that they can get back up. And then they move further away from the floor. Like, that's very interesting.
Right. Well, so there's a lot of physical challenge for someone sitting on the floor if they're not used to it. What I'm noticing so far, before getting into those details, we're really just talking about mindset. And there's a way that if you've always been doing this, as you say, it's kind of no big deal. It wasn't a big deal to you before you noticed that for so many other people,
Yes.
it wasn't. So how does one begin to kind of break down that mental block? You know, I imagine if you're teaching your clients to sit on the floor, some of them initially might just be like not even wanting to go there. Have you had that experience? And then how do you encourage someone like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And for somebody and who has not really gone down to the floor and sit down on the floor, unless they had a fall and then they're on the floor, there's a lot of fear and the mental block, like you said. Like, well, I don't go down there. And it's not probably reasonable for them to, okay, well, for me to tell them, let's just get down on the floor, because, well, it takes tremendous amount of effort, and then maybe other people to help them and to do that. So I would say, if they are used to sitting in a recliner chair, maybe, find another surface that is a little bit closer to the floor, gradually introducing and exposing the body to slightly different demands, more demands than what their body's used to. So gradual, incremental increase in the demands and the physical demands is much more reasonable for them if they're getting used to sitting on a high chair. Recliner chair, maybe something maybe a few inches lower than that. That's much more agreeable and reasonable for them. It's not without inducing fear for them. Like, I can do that. I can do that. So I'm not used to it, but I can do that.
Like,
and then
tiptoeing outside of the comfort zone a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that would be my, I guess, the way to introduce somebody who's not accustomed to sitting on the floor to get a little bit more comfortable moving closer to the floor, inch by inch.
Yeah, you said that, again, that for you were sitting on the floor all the time, and I imagine, a lot of the martial arts practice. But here I feel like when we're talking about the mindset and the fear, that's a place where the Feldenkrais method can be really useful, because you can break things down. And even the question of, like, what happens to my body, what happens to my muscles in a state of fear, but I'm wondering if you're drawing on the martial arts as well, because I know that in the martial arts, fear is a primary question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so
Fear.
let's. I wasn't sure if you wanted to say more on that. Well, just maybe let's talk about if I'm new to sitting on the floor and I've started to adjust, like sounds like the furniture is an important piece. And I was noticing the difference between, you mentioned a chair, but also a recliner and a couch. The thing about those often in the United States, people are sitting on pretty smushy furniture too. Whereas when you're on the floor, it's a hard surface generally. And so I imagine that's part of the adaptation is just getting used to really working more with being on a hard surface.
Yeah. And also it depends on their body type and physique, and if they have more soft tissues, maybe not as, just being on the harder surface is not as much of a big deal compared to other ones who are much leaner, don't have much tissues and soft tissues around, more bony parts, maybe not so comfortable. Then yeah, of course, would like to have something to protect those areas. But getting used to a different surface is, it's part of the adaptation. But of course, you can make it more comfortable. You can sit on a cushion. I do sit on a cushion. I don't find just sitting on the hard wood floor or the concrete and for a long time comfortable. And of course, I do use some sort of cushion or blanket or something to make it a little more comfortable. But it's not a. Some people ask me about the benefits of sitting on the floor, and for some people who think that it's sitting on the floor that makes and that provides the benefits, but to me that's one thing, but another thing is sitting on the floor and you have to get up, you have to get down. So what comes with the sitting on the floor is all the movements, right? And that you do have to get down onto the floor. You do have to get back up from the floor. Every time you sit on the floor, then you'll be moving a lot more than, right? And just think about the difference, getting in, getting out of the chair, getting in, getting out of the recliner, or getting up from the floor, getting down onto the floor, and throughout the day. And that is, if you add all those movements by the end of the day in one day, that's quite a bit of difference.
Right. So that's the benefit. It's not just the static sitting position that highlighting here.
I think that's more the benefits. And another thing is that sitting movement is really confined by the chair. You sit in a chair, but then how much of the movement is available to you? Of course, you can move your body in a chair, but if you're sitting in an open area on the floor, you constantly move. You can change how many different ways you can sit on the floor. And versus in a chair, you cross your legs, you shift yourself a little bit, but not much. Sitting on the floor, you can sit cross-legged, you can sit sideways, you can, sit in a seiza or on the heels, or a variety of ways that you can adapt to in sitting. So there's a lot more movement options availability with sitting on the floor. That's another benefit.
Right. Yeah. When I think about sitting on a chair, it's like I have this little square of real estate that if I think I'm sitting in the chair, I'm probably not going to peel myself away from that. Whereas I'm basically sitting on a surface that stretches for the whole room when I'm on the floor. So even though I might, let's say, be sitting on the floor in front of my computer or something and not going too far, there's this potential to also just move further through space, which is likely to involve more joints and just feel more connected to the environment in that way. Yeah. So do you want to talk about some of the particular sitting positions you just mentioned? Like if someone doesn't sit on the floor so much, is there a particular position on the floor that you would tend to invite them to try first? Oops, I think we might be a little frozen here. Okay, we had a little technical glitch there for a moment. But Taro, would you like to tell us a little bit about some of the different positions sitting on the floor? Like maybe where would you begin with someone who isn't so used to sitting on the floor, and just talk a little bit about the benefits, the challenges of some of the different floor sitting positions.
Yeah. It's so the common, there's some, several, well, there are a lot of different ways to sit on the floor, but some of the ways that I do use quite often is sitting cross-leg, and then also the side sitting where one leg is behind, the other leg is in front. And my favorite is not probably most people's favorite, but since I'm Japanese, I do sit in seiza, which is sitting on the heels. Quite comfortable for me. For a lot of people who are not used to sitting on the floor, it's probably not even an option at the moment, and in the beginning anyways. But I do find most people initially they have a challenge and maybe some discomfort in your low back, around the hips, because those body parts are not really used to being in that positions, that much demands. And so a way that I think about and to make it easier is to reduce the demands on those parts. And you can use meditation cushion or the meditation pillow or something like that that is quite thick, or you can just use a regular cushion or thick blankets, fold it up and make it as high as you need to, so that it is not really causing too much of discomfort in your body, particularly in your low back or the hips. And people who don't really have a great mobility through the hips, most people don't really have a great mobility around the hips, and people who are not accustomed to sitting on the floor, because in a normal sitting in a chair or the couch, sitting on the couch, it doesn't really require a lot of mobility movements through the hips. And so naturally over the years, and people, unless they do some activities that require the movements in the hips, they over time they start to lose that range of motion. And so you can, by raising the surface a bit and reduce the demands on the hips, which will reduce the demands for your low back, which is probably a good way to start. And whether you're sitting sideways or you're sitting in a cross leg, or if you want to try sitting in seiza style, you can also do that by adding a pillow between your sit bones and or the thighs, the back of your thighs and your calves. You can add some pillow so it's not, there's a little bit of gap in between, and that might be a little more comfortable way to start. Even that is still challenging, and as I mentioned earlier, first, and just trying out and sitting in a slightly lower chair is even an option. You can try that. So that way, not that you'll be sitting in a new chair for a long time, but just you have to think about incremental increase. And so if it is the first time to try it, then don't think about doing it for an hour at a time. Even just starting in 5 minutes, that might be enough for your body. You really have to pay attention to your own body and feel, and don't force your body and force yourselves to be. It's not a torture. You can just expose your body to a new challenge, but gradually, and then you'll be more successful. Don't have to torture your bodies to condition and into a new environment. There's a better way to do that.
Mm-hmm. Something I'm noticing is the way you're describing working towards sitting on the floor, you're really talking about life habits. Whereas in the Feldenkrais method, of course, there's the process known as awareness through movement, which there are processes that are specifically about sitting on the floor. And if I go to an awareness through movement class, I could be on the floor for 45 minutes or an hour, and I might learn a new pattern. And I know that you do this with your clients, but at the same time, it sounds like you're talking about a strategy that really has to be organized over like weeks and months and years. So it's, even though that awareness through movement lesson can help me to get clear, it also sounds like there's a commitment that one has to make over time here.
Right. Yeah. Otherwise, when people look at things as, okay, so tell me and teach me exercises that improve my mobility so that I can sit on the floor, well, then you have to think about how many years it has taken for you to get to the place where you're at. It is not really reasonable to come up and to find an exercise that address that, and then you all of a sudden you can sit on the floor comfortably. Well, you have to think a long term, and then what do you do? And it really, and you have to think more. You have to have a broader picture of your lifestyle. What do you go through, and how do you get to the place where you're at right now? And all the things you do every day, that's the habits and daily routines that are not allowing your bodies to move in a certain way. And then you can start to change that a little bit. And in addition, then you can incorporate some of the movement practice and the movement lesson from a Feldenkrais method. That would be really, really helpful. But just doing the movement practice once a day, once a week, getting down on the floor, well, of course it is good, but that's not going to really change. Then in a month, and you'll be able to sit on the floor comfortably. Probably not. Probably not. Yeah.
And at the same time, probably a lot of people who can't sit on the floor, there's also aches and pains that also have to be overcome. I noticed that you actually have a video on your channel about getting down safely on the floor for someone who had a hip replacement. And I was curious to hear about that, or maybe just any stories you might have about sitting on the floor with particular clients that you think would be interesting to talk about.
Yeah, hip replacement is definitely one thing. And I do see clients after hip replacement a lot too. So there are some precautions, that movements and the positions that they're not supposed to be in because of that restrictions, that surgical restrictions. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be on the floor, because, well, guess what? If they have a fall, they're on the floor. So what do they do? It's good to think about what happens when although you don't really intend to be on the floor, but you may end up on the floor. And if you do end up on the floor, if you don't know how to get back up, well, that's not a good place to be in. So just even think about how you might get there in case you have a certain conditions. And I do have videos and teaching them how safely and they can get down onto the floor and get back up with that certain restrictions, like hip precautions, or somebody who had total knee replacement who can't really still bear weight and put a weight on that surgical knee, and maybe doesn't have a great range of motion through the knee. And there's a way that they can still learns to get down on the floor if they have to, and get back up, or no weight bearing after the ankle surgery or any lower leg surgery that they're not supposed to put any weight on one leg. Well, what do they do? How do they get down onto the floor and things like that? So I do have videos and showing people how to get down on the floor and get back up from the floor with a certain constraint.
And I imagine for a person in that situation to actually do so successfully and not hurt themselves, that must really change their way of thinking about what's possible.
Yeah, and then yeah, that gives them much more confidence and reduces the fear tremendously.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, you told me before that you're an early riser, and we're talking here hopefully earlier than your son gets up, but this is around the time you told me he might come in. I just thought it would be fun at the end of our conversation to actually learn a little bit about your son, because he's in many of your YouTube videos. And of course, we all know that children are so much more comfortable on the floor. What's it like just, working with your son, and what's your, I don't know, what's the perspective that we can learn by watching children on the floor?
Yeah, certainly. My son is he's 6 and he soon's to be 7. But I've been fortunate and to have my son and be able to really play with him and then watch him grow. And there is a lot, and he constantly reminds me of all the things that I used to do as a child. And from an adult's perspective, how we limit ourselves, and physically, mentally, both. And even just the daily movements and daily activities, not a lot of varieties when we have set routines
Mm-hmm.
and certain ways to sit, certain ways to get up, and not as many variety as my son, who is quite adaptable and is still not set in a certain routines or the habits.
Mm-hmm.
Watching him just playing on the floor or just running around and sitting, he never sits the same way,
Mm-hmm.
and he never, rolls on the floor in the same way. And there's so many ways that he actually uses his body, himself. That's really a nice thing to have. And then I think adults, we can learn to do that and embrace all sorts of possibilities and that we still have, and
Mm-hmm.
we just don't see that. And
Mm-hmm.
but we can definitely learn from our kids and watching them, what how do they move, what do they do go to every day. Yeah.
Right. In the videos where I've seen him also, of course, there's like no fear, just joy.
Yep. That's right, that's right.
Yeah. And I imagine, just kind of going back to where we began, you were talking about growing up and seeing your father. What a gift that he looks up and sees his father on the floor too. Yeah,
That's right, yeah. So
yeah,
it's a pleasure, yeah.
yeah. Just before we wrap up, anything else that you feel like you'd like to add on this whole topic of sitting on the floor? Just
Oh, sure. Yeah. One thing, I was just recently chatting with my friend who was born in Japan, but he then with the family moved to the States at the age of 3. And he grew up and spent most of the time in the United States. So his parents are Japanese and he's Japanese yet. And he adapted to the lifestyle in the United States, right? So a lot of people, and when watching my videos and where I talked about the benefits of the sitting on the floor or the squatting and things like that, and some people comment and ask like, well, is that because you're Japanese, you're an Asian,
mm,
don't you have an advantages, maybe genetically?
mm,
Maybe so, but at the same time, my friend, and who spent most of the time, adulthood and the kids and the childhood in the United States, he couldn't sit and do the seiza sitting. He couldn't really sit on the floor comfortably. And then when he graduated from a college, and then he got a job in Japan, and then he lived in Japan for 7 years or so, that's when he really learned to sit on the floor.
mm,
And then he can sit on the floor comfortably. But his older brother, who spent in the United States, he can't sit down on the floor, right? So you can't just assume just because one from different place, and then that's advantage, maybe advantage, but maybe you're not. Well, that's maybe not the case. And my martial arts Aikido sensei, and he's in 70s, and he grew up in the United States, and he's a Caucasian. He can sit on the floor comfortably. So I think there's a lot, and I know many martial artists, and regardless of where they're from, they have the ability to do that. So I think there is that some component of the genetics and the cultural background, the advantages, but at the same time, I think the lifestyle plays a huge role. So don't assume because of your cultural backgrounds, ethnicity, that maybe you shouldn't do it or you can't do it. Bodies are quite adaptable. So is the brain. If you give and feed your body, feed the brain just a little bit, enough, without overwhelming, it'll adapt. May take a time, but it'll adapt. So don't get discouraged. And if you think like, oh, I'm too old, I challenge you. Yeah.
Yeah. As I listen to you talk about sitting on the floor this way, it almost strikes me, it's like talking about learning a new language. And we're talking about, immersion maybe, but that there's a certain point I also just get from talking to you that it really becomes a pleasure. And it just opens up, more possibility in life.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, Taro, it was such a pleasure talking to you today. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Seth.
Yeah, all right. Take care.
Yeah, take care.